My name is David Harmon. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer, built bridges across 4 states, and watched 2 of my kids grow up in a house I paid for with my own hands and my own sweat. I retired at 66 with a pension, a portfolio my financial advisor called impressively conservative, and a 4-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Drive that I'd owned outright since my wife, Patricia, passed 6 years ago. I tell you all of this, not to brag. I tell you because what happened on the Sunday before Thanksgiving last year only makes sense if you understand exactly what I had and exactly who decided they were entitled to it. I was not a lonely man. I want to be clear about that. People assume that a widower in his late 60s rattling around a 4-bedroom house must be desperate for company, must be counting the minutes until someone fills those empty rooms with noise and life and the smell of someone else's cooking. That was not me. I had my routines. Monday and Wednesday mornings I walked 4 miles along the Greenway Trail behind the neighborhood. I had a standing poker game every other Thursday with 3 guys I'd known since our kids were in Little League together. I volunteered twice a month at the county library helping adults learn to read. I was not sitting by the window waiting for someone to rescue me from my own life. My son's name is Kyle. He's 38, works in commercial real estate, and has what I would describe as a very comfortable lifestyle funded almost entirely by the commission of other people's optimism. His wife, I'll call her my daughter-in-law because that is what she is named Brenda. Brenda came from money, which is a particular kind of dangerous because people who come from money often believe that proximity to wealth is the same thing as deserving it. She had opinions about everything, about how Kyle should dress, about which neighborhoods were worth living in, about what kind of car said the right things about a family. She had opinions about my house, too, though it took her nearly 3 years of marriage to finally say them out loud. The trouble started, as most trouble does, slowly and then all at once. It was Kyle who brought it up first. About 8 months before everything fell apart, we were having lunch at a sports bar near his office. Just the 2 of us. The kind of lunch that used to feel easy and now felt like he was working up to something. He kept checking his phone. He ordered a beer and then didn't really drink it. Finally, about halfway through our sandwiches, he said he and Brenda had been talking about their situation. I asked him what situation that was. He said the market had been rough, that a few deals had fallen through, that they were carrying more on their mortgage than they'd anticipated, and Brenda's parents were getting older and might need support soon. He said it in the careful way people say things when they've rehearsed it, when the words have been smoothed down by repetition until all the sharp edges are gone. I listened. I nodded. I didn't say anything right away because I'd been an engineer long enough to know that the first proposal is never the real proposal. I waited. Then he said it. He said Brenda's parents, Harold and Connie, both in their early 70s, both perfectly healthy as far as I knew, were looking at a transition, that the house they were renting in Scottsdale had gotten expensive, that they were thinking about relocating to be closer to family, and that Kyle and Brenda had been thinking, since I had the space, since the kids were grown, since it was just me and that 4-bedroom house on Birchwood Drive, they'd been thinking maybe Harold and Connie could move into the 2 spare bedrooms on the 2nd floor. I put down my sandwich. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder than anger. It was the specific, clarifying feeling of understanding exactly what is happening, even as someone is still pretending it's a conversation. I told Kyle that I appreciated him sharing that, and that I would think about it. He looked relieved, which told me he'd expected more resistance, and had interpreted my composure as agreement. We finished lunch. He paid the check. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking out at Patricia's garden, which I still maintained exactly the way she'd planted it. And I thought about what I was going to do. I did not say yes. I also did not say no, not that day, because I wanted to understand the full shape of what was being asked before I responded to it. Over the following weeks, Brenda started calling more often. Little check-ins, she called them. How was I feeling? Was the house getting to be too much to manage? Had I thought any more about what Kyle had mentioned? Each call was wrapped in concern, the way a hook is wrapped in bait. And I let her talk because I was learning. What I learned was this. Brenda's parents had been cut off financially by her brother in Arizona after some falling out I was never given the full details of. Their social security together was modest. They had no savings to speak of, or none that Brenda would admit to. And Kyle and Brenda's finances were apparently in worse shape than Kyle had let on at lunch. There was mention of a second car lease they were trying to get out of. And Brenda's habit of traveling to see her college friends 3 times a year was not, as far as I could tell, slowing down regardless of the rough market. What they wanted was simple. They wanted me to house 4 people myself and both of Brenda's parents in my home, indefinitely, with no discussion of rent or contribution or anything resembling an arrangement. They wanted it framed as generosity on their part, as a gift they were giving me, the gift of company, the gift of not being alone. They wanted me grateful. I called my attorney in the first week of October. His name is Warren, and I've known him since our boys played on the same soccer team in middle school. Warren does estates and trusts and the kind of quiet legal work that most people don't think about until they desperately need it. I told him I wanted to meet, that there were some things I needed to update and some things I needed to understand. We met at his office on a Thursday afternoon when the maple out front had gone fully red, and I laid out everything. Warren listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You saw this coming." I told him I'd hoped I was wrong. He said that was the thing about hope. It didn't change the architecture of a situation. Then he got to work. Over the next 3 weeks, we restructured. The house went into a revocable living trust, with provisions that made any transfer of residency rights require my explicit written consent that could not be compelled by family relationship or emotional pressure. My investment accounts were reviewed, and certain beneficiary designations were updated. We also had a conversation about documentation, about what it would mean legally if someone were to access my financial accounts without authorization, and Warren walked me through exactly what to watch for and exactly what to preserve if it happened. I also had a security system installed, new cameras, interior and exterior, with cloud backup. The company that did the installation was a former client of mine from my engineering days, and they did good work. I told Kyle and Brenda about the cameras in a casual way, mentioned it over the phone like it was something I'd done for insurance purposes. Brenda said that was very smart, Dad. She called me Dad. She'd started doing that in the last year, and I had never asked her to. I gave Kyle my answer in the 3rd week of October. I called him on a Tuesday evening, and I told him clearly, without anger and without apology, that I would not be having Brenda's parents move into my home. I told him I wished Harold and Connie well, and that I hoped they found a situation that worked for them, but that my home was my home, and I was not in a position financially, emotionally, or logistically to take on that responsibility. I told him I loved him, and that this decision was not a reflection of how I felt about him. The silence on the line lasted about 4 seconds. Then Kyle said, "Brenda's not going to take this well." I told him I understood, and that I hoped he would help her understand. He did not help her understand. What followed was 3 weeks of a particular kind of family warfare that people who haven't experienced it tend to underestimate. There were no screaming phone calls. There were no dramatic confrontations at my door. What there was, instead, was a slow withdrawal of warmth calls that went to voicemail and were returned 2 days later with clipped responses. A birthday dinner for my grandson that I was not invited to until 48 hours before, a silence in the family group chat that used to move constantly. My daughter, who lives in Portland and stays mostly out of Kyle's business, texted me privately to say she didn't know what was going on, but that Kyle seemed off. I told her I'd explain later. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, Kyle called and asked if I wanted to come to their place for a pre-holiday dinner. His voice was carefully normal, the kind of normal that takes effort. I said yes. I thought, this is where it ends, one way or another. I had a feeling about that meal the way you have a feeling about a structure before you test it. Something in the load distribution was wrong. I drove to their house on Sunday evening with a bottle of red wine I'd bought at the Good Wine Shop on Clement Street and a pecan pie from the bakery where Patricia used to order for holidays. Kyle answered the door and hugged me in that brief, shoulder-only way that men use when they are performing warmth they don't currently feel. Brenda was in the kitchen and called out a hello without coming to the door. The house smelled good. They'd done a pot roast, which is Kyle's actual best dish. He learned it from watching his mother, which is one of the things about him I have always genuinely loved. We sat in the living room and had a glass of wine and talked about safe things. My grandson's soccer season, a renovation Kyle was involved with downtown, the weather turning cold. Brenda came out of the kitchen twice to refill things, and both times she smiled at me with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Harold and Connie were not there. I had wondered if they would be. They weren't. We sat down to dinner around 7. The pot roast was good. My grandson ate half of his and fed the rest to the dog under the table, and Kyle pretended not to notice. It was almost easy. I thought for a moment that maybe I'd been wrong about the shape of the evening, that maybe Kyle had decided to let it go, that maybe Brenda had adjusted her expectations to match reality. Then Kyle cleared his grandson's plate, sent him to watch television in the other room, and sat back down at the table. He said, "Dad, we need to talk about the situation with Brenda's parents." I said I thought I'd been clear. He said I had been, but that he wanted to revisit it because circumstances had changed. Harold had been to the doctor, and there was some concern, nothing definitive, he said, but concern about Harold's heart, and that made the distance from family harder. That Connie couldn't manage alone if Harold needed more care. That it wasn't fair, really, for me to have all that space. That word, fair. I set down my fork. I looked at my son across the dinner table in the house he lived in with his wife, and I thought about every year I'd spent building a life that was mine, every decision Patricia and I had made together, every morning I'd gotten up and gone to work and come home and been present and responsible and prepared, and I said, calmly, that I didn't think fairness was quite the right frame for this conversation. Brenda said, "Then what is the right frame, David?" I said the right frame was that it was my house, purchased with my earnings, paid off over 30 years, and that I was not obligated to share it with anyone I had not chosen to share it with. She said, "So you're just going to sit in that big house alone while my parents struggle? That's your decision?" I said yes. Kyle said, "That's incredibly selfish, Dad." I had expected those words. I had thought about them, actually, lying awake in the weeks before, turning them over in my mind the way you'd turn over a stone to see what's underneath. I knew they were coming. Knowing they were coming did not make them land softly. There is something specific about hearing your own child call you selfish for protecting the life you built, something that goes past the logical understanding that the accusation is unfair and lands somewhere older and deeper. I felt it. I want to be honest about that. I took a breath. I said that I understood he felt that way, and that it didn't change my answer. Brenda stood up from the table. I don't think she had planned what happened next. Or maybe she had. I've thought about it many times since, and I genuinely cannot tell you. What I know is that she picked up her wine glass, a full one she'd just poured, and she threw it at me across the table. She didn't throw it softly. She threw it the way you throw something when you have been holding something back for a long time and have finally decided not to hold it anymore. The glass hit the edge of my plate and shattered. And the wine, it was a deep red. A Cabernet went across my shirt and jacket and face, and one of the glass fragments caught the back of my right hand and left a cut about an inch long. For about 3 seconds, nobody said anything. I looked at the blood on my hand. I looked at the wine soaking into my shirt. I looked at Brenda, who was standing with her hand still in the follow-through, and her face had done the thing faces do when a person realizes they have gone further than they meant to go, further than they can explain away. Kyle said, "Brenda." I picked up my napkin from my lap and pressed it against my hand. I stood up from the table. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair, and I said, in a voice I am proud of for being level, that I was going to leave now. Brenda said, "You provoked." I said, "Don't." I walked to the front door. Kyle followed me into the hallway, saying my name, saying Dad, saying wait, saying she didn't mean it. I told him I loved him, that I always would, and that I would be in touch. I opened the front door and I walked to my car and I sat in the driver's seat in the dark for approximately 90 seconds. Then I took out my phone and I texted Warren. I wrote 4 words. It happened. Start the clock. Warren had told me, in our last meeting, that if there was ever a physical incident, to document everything immediately, photo of the injury, exact time, exact location, exact description of events, while the memory was still sharp. He said, "And I will always remember this, David. I hope this never happens. But if it does, the 90 seconds after are the most important 90 seconds you'll have." I had thought about those words many times in the weeks since he said them. I took photos of my hand with the cut still fresh, the napkin pressed against it. I took a photo of my shirt and jacket, dark with wine. I wrote a voice memo on my phone, dated and time-stamped, describing exactly what had been said and in what order, including the specific words, incredibly selfish, Dad from Kyle, and the moment Brenda threw the glass. My hand was shaking slightly while I did this, and I want to be honest about that too. I was 68 years old, sitting in the dark outside my son's house with a cut on my hand and wine on my Father's Day gift shirt, and there was a part of me that wanted to go back inside and pretend none of it had happened. I did not do that. I drove to the urgent care on Millbrook Avenue. The cut needed 3 stitches. The nurse who treated me asked how it happened, and I told her plainly. I told her there had been a domestic incident at a family dinner, that a glass had been thrown at me, and that I had documentation. She noted it in the chart. I asked her to note specifically that the laceration was consistent with broken glass, and that I had reported the cause at the time of treatment. She looked at me a little carefully when I said that, the way medical people look when they realize a patient is saying something intentional. And she said she would note it exactly as I'd described. Warren called me while I was in the waiting room for the stitches. I told him everything in the same order I'd recorded it. He said he was sorry. Then he said, "Good, you did everything right." He told me not to respond to any calls or messages from Kyle or Brenda that evening, and to send him all the documentation photos, voice memo, urgent care visit before I went to sleep. I did all of that. I drove home on Birchwood Drive just after 10 o'clock. I unlocked the front door and turned on the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the quiet of my own house. Patricia's garden was dark outside the window. There was a cardinal that came to the feeder most mornings, a male, so red it seemed almost improbable against the November trees. I thought about that bird. I thought about how much of my life had been built in this house, in this kitchen, with that woman, and I thought about how close I had come to letting other people decide what it was worth. I am not an angry man by nature. Patricia used to say my default setting was patience to a fault. But standing in that kitchen after what had happened, I felt something that I think was closer to resolution than anger, a settling of something that had been unsettled for months. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I knew it because Warren and I had planned it, and because the cameras in that house and in mine had captured everything, and because I had done every single thing exactly right in exactly the right order. I slept better than I expected. The next morning, Warren filed a police report on my behalf. I went in and gave a formal statement describing the incident as assault, because under our state's law, throwing an object that causes injury is classified as assault regardless of the intent claimed by the person who threw it. The officer who took my statement was professional and serious. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and I told him I was still considering my options, but that I wanted the record to exist. He said that was a reasonable position. Warren also sent a formal letter to Kyle and Brenda that same morning, advising them that the incident had been documented and reported, that my medical records confirmed the nature of the injury, and that any further contact that could be construed as harassment or pressure regarding my housing arrangements would be treated accordingly. The letter was brief and extremely precise, and Warren charged me the flat rate we'd agreed on at the start of all this, because that's the kind of man he is. Kyle called me at 11 that morning. I answered on the third ring. He said, "Dad, we need to talk about what happened." I said I agreed, and that I was listening. He said Brenda was devastated, that she hadn't slept, that she wanted me to know it wasn't what it looked like, that she had not been trying to hurt me, that it had been a moment of frustration, that she was under enormous stress with her parents' situation, and she'd lost control for 1 second, and she was so sorry. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Kyle, I love you. I want you to hear that clearly before I say the rest of this." He said, "Okay." I said, "Your wife threw a glass at me at a dinner table in front of your house where your son was 20 feet away. I have 3 stitches in my hand. I have a police report. I have a letter from my attorney, and I have the entire evening on camera from the moment I walked in your door to the moment I walked out, including the table, including Brenda, including you telling me I was being selfish. Silence. I said, I am not interested in discussing whether she meant it. I am not interested in the level of her stress. I am interested in the following: that this never happens again. That the subject of anyone moving into my home is closed permanently, and that you take some time, real time, not a week, to think about what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward. Because I intend to be in your son's life for as long as I'm alive, and that means we need to figure out how to do this differently. Kyle said, The cameras, you had cameras inside too? I said the security company had done an excellent job. He said, Dad, I didn't know she was going to... I told him I believed him. I told him that I did not think he had known, and that this was actually an important distinction, because it meant there was still something to work with between us. But I told him that Brenda owed me a direct, unscripted apology, not a text, not a message through him, and that I would not be coming to Thanksgiving this year, or to any family event where the subject of Harold and Connie's housing situation might come up, until we had established some different terms. He said that was fair. I almost told him to be careful with that word. I let it go. What happened over the following month was not a clean resolution. I want to be honest about that too, because the stories where everything snaps neatly into place at the end are satisfying to watch, but they are not always true. Life tends to fray at the edges. Brenda called me 12 days later. She cried. It was not performed, crying, or at least it didn't sound performed. It was the kind of crying people do when they have finally run out of the story they'd been telling themselves about their own behavior and have had to confront the actual thing they did. She said she was ashamed. She said she didn't recognize herself in what she had done. She said she'd started talking to a therapist. She said she knew she had no right to ask me to forgive her, but that she was asking anyway. I told her I accepted her apology. I meant it, more or less. I told her that forgiveness and trust were different things, and that the trust would take longer, and I couldn't promise her what it would look like on the other side. She said she understood. I did not tell her about the trust documents. There was no reason to tell her. The house was protected regardless of what she knew or didn't know, and Warren had advised me that the specific details of my estate planning were my business and no one else's. I did not tell Kyle either. Not then. I would eventually... I thought there would come a time when it made sense to sit down with him and be transparent about how I had structured things and why, when enough time had passed that it could be a conversation instead of a confrontation. Harold and Connie, as it turned out, found a solution through a program in Scottsdale that I later looked up, a senior co-housing community with subsidized rates for people at certain income levels. I learned this through Kyle in a brief, informational tone, like he was sharing a news item. I said that was good news. He said yes. We talked for about 8 more minutes about other things, carefully, like two people learning to walk on new ground after an earthquake, testing each foot before putting weight on it. I went back to my routines. Monday and Wednesday mornings on the Greenway. Poker on the second and fourth Thursday. Library volunteering. The Cardinal came back to the feeder in December, the same one or one that looked identical, and I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched him for a while. My daughter called from Portland in mid-December. She'd gotten more of the story by then, mostly from Kyle, and I could hear in her voice that she was calibrating between worry and loyalty and the particular frustration of a person who was not in the room when something happened and has had to reconstruct it from the accounts of interested parties. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I was. She asked if Kyle had apologized. I told her that was a complicated question. She said that was a complicated answer. I told her what I've said before, and what I still believe, that I am not fragile, that 68 years old in this particular decade, in this particular body, with this particular life behind me, means something different from what people seem to imagine when they picture a man my age alone in a large house. I walk 4 miles twice a week. I built bridges. I stayed married to a woman I loved for 31 years and was with her when she died and didn't fall apart. which is the hardest thing I have ever done. I managed my own affairs, made my own decisions, structured my own protection long before anyone came to test it. Nobody gave me those empty rooms to feel sorry for. I earned them. My daughter was quiet for a moment after I said all of that. Then she said, "Dad, do you know how much you sound like Mom when you get like this?" I told her I would take that as the highest possible compliment. She laughed. It was the real kind of laugh, the kind that means something has relaxed between two people. We talked for another 40 minutes, about her work, about her kids, about a renovation she was planning in the spring. It was a good conversation. It was the kind of conversation I intend to keep having for as many years as my body allows. On the first morning of January, I walked the Greenway Trail in the cold with my hands in my jacket pockets and the bare trees on either side of me, making the kind of architecture that only winter allows. I have always liked January. People treat it as the difficult month, the hangover after the holidays, the long gray corridor before anything green happens again. I don't see it that way. I see it as clarity. Everything stripped down to what it actually is. My house on Birchwood Drive was what it actually was, mine. Built and bought and paid for and protected. The cameras in the corners of the rooms doing their quiet work. Warren's documents sitting in a file in his office and a copy in the fireproof safe in my closet. The cardinal at the feeder. The garden coming back, eventually, the way it always did. There are things I would do differently if I had to do them again. I would have had the direct conversation with Kyle earlier, not about the answer, which was always going to be no, but about what was underneath the ask, about whether he was being pressured by his wife or whether the pressure was coming from somewhere in himself. I don't know the answer to that even now. I would have been clearer, earlier, that my autonomy was not a problem to be managed by people who loved me, but a fact of my life to be respected by them. And I would tell anyone who's in the early stages of something like this, anyone who is starting to feel the shape of a conversation they haven't had yet, the gathering weight of an expectation they never agreed to, I would tell them not to wait. Not out of paranoia and not out of anger, but because preparation is not the same as conflict. Getting your affairs in order is not the same as declaring war on your family. It is the opposite of that. It is doing the quiet, serious work of making sure that love between you and the people you came from is not contaminated by the question of what you have and who gets it when you're gone. Protect yourself cleanly, early, and without apology. Set the limits before the dinner. Get the cameras before the wine. I have not regretted it for a single morning since. Kyle and I had lunch in February at a place we both like near the river. He paid. He asked about the Greenway, about poker, about the library. He asked, carefully, how the house was doing, not the way he used to ask it, with an agenda underneath, but the way a person asks about something they understand now is not theirs to weigh in on. I told him the furnace had needed a new part in January, but otherwise the house was exactly as it had always been. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for my part in it." I told him I knew. I told him that was enough to start with. We ordered dessert and talked about my grandson's upcoming birthday. I said I would very much like to take him to a baseball game in the spring, if the timing worked out, just the two of us, like I used to do with Kyle when he was that age. Kyle said his son would love that. He said his son asked about me, specifically, more than he probably realized. I thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would have made of all of it, the calculation of it, the cameras, the 4 words I texted Warren while sitting in my car with blood on my hand. She had been more instinctively generous than I was, quicker to assume the best. But she also had been the one who taught me, 30 years ago, when we were trying to help a family member who had no boundaries about what was ours. She had been the one who said, "David, being generous doesn't mean being a floor for other people to walk on." I ordered the apple tart. Kyle ordered the chocolate thing. We sat there by the window with the river moving outside, still mostly iced over in February, but with dark water starting to show through in the middle. And it looked exactly like what it was. Something that had been frozen beginning, slowly, to move again. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough.